There appears to be this growing movement online, especially by this new carnivore community, claiming that LDL cholesterol isn't harmful at all.
Why I am not afraid of my quote unquote elevated LDL.
LDL cholesterol has nothing to do with heart disease. It's not part of the causal pathway.
There's no evidence that elevated LDL leads to atherosclerosis.
Some people almost think it's beneficial.
It almost seems to be worn by some as a badge of honor.
And I've heard you say, I think it was on Rogan, you said you've been up to like 500 at one point of LDL.
Not now, but in the past, yeah.
I don't know why he's smiling. It's not that funny, man. You'll hear all sorts of arguments about oxidation, inflammation, and metabolic health that sound very compelling on the surface. For instance, some people claim that LDL cholesterol is only detrimental if you're metabolically unwell or have insulin resistance.
Any study in which LDL cholesterol is stratified by a metric that correlates with insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance, you see totally different amounts of correlation between LDL and cardiovascular disease when people are very insulin resistant versus minimally insulin resistant.
But when you look into the actual science, I'm talking large-scale randomized controlled trials, Mendelian randomization, decades of clinical data, a very different picture emerges. Now, why is this discussion so important? Well, the leading cause of mortality is cardiovascular disease, and ignoring or misinterpreting research along this dialogue or pushing a false narrative can have very detrimental effects for our health on both a population and individual level. In this video, I hope to close the argument regarding LDL cholesterol and discuss strategies near the end that can be used to lower your LDL cholesterol even if you're eating a lot of animal protein like myself. Let's start with the basics. You probably already know that fat and water don't really mix. Like when you pour oil in water, it separates into two distinct layers. That's because fat is insoluble in water. But your body needs to transport fats like cholesterol and triglycerides through the bloodstream, which is mainly water. To solve this dilemma, your body uses special carriers known as lipoproteins. Lipo, as you're probably aware, means fat, and protein is, well, protein. And proteins are water soluble, which is why your protein shake mixes evenly instead of spreading out like oil. Lipoproteins package fat and cholesterol into particles that can travel through the bloodstream. There are different types, but the two most well-known ones are LDL, or low-density lipoprotein, which carries more fat and less protein, so it's lower density, and HDL, or high-density lipoprotein, which has more protein and less fat. When you see LDL cholesterol on a blood test, it's not measuring the amount of LDL particles, it's measuring the cholesterol that is being carried inside them. Cholesterol is just one of the fats lipoproteins carry, but it's a very important one when it comes to heart disease risk. Let's get into the discussion. The first argument made by the, let's call it pro-LDL community is...
And if we just think about it evolutionarily, why would evolution have designed a particle that kills us?
Fair point. LDL cholesterol is needed in the body to transport essential fats that are the backbone for hormones like testosterone, for instance. However, it's easily debunked. Like LDL, we have glucose, which is needed for numerous bodily functions. In fact, it's essential for the proper functioning of every organ system. But there's a condition called diabetes, in case you're not aware, where you have an excess amount of glucose that is pathological and implicated in numerous chronic diseases. Likewise, the argument being proposed is not that LDL cholesterol is necessarily bad for us. Rather, it is chronically high levels of LDL, which can cause heart disease, that is deemed to be the problem. To further this weak argument, carnivore doctors often quote genetic disorders characterized by an inability to process cholesterol.
There's a genetic condition called Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, which is a mutation in one of the enzymes that makes cholesterol. It's pretty far down in the pathway. But a lot of these kids die in utero. Those that are born have severe retardation, both mental and physical. They're extremely resistant. They're extremely susceptible to infections, and they have a lot of problems with sleep and diabetes and other issues because they don't make cholesterol. They have extremely low LDL because they can't make cholesterol in the liver.
Again, similarly, there's a lot of glycogen storage diseases, which are inherited metabolic disorders that disrupt the body's ability to store and break down glycogen, a form of glucose. A lot of these conditions are associated with growth failure, risk of sudden death, proximal weakness, and so on. You can make it sound really scary. However, inferring that this means we should be eating a lot of sugar is not necessarily the correct conclusion. Now, the next argument that is often made is that fasting causes LDL cholesterol to rise, and fasting is good for you, so LDL cholesterol by extension must also be good for you.
Incidentally, both LDL and uric acid rise when humans fast. So if you stop eating, your LDL is going to go up. And that's been demonstrated multiple times in studies. Your free fatty acids are going to go up, your LDL is going to go up. And so you kind of scratch your head there, at least I did, and looked at this and thought, are you telling me that in something that would happen routinely for humans, fasting, like we talked about, intermittent fasting, unsuccessful hunts, that's killing us in a way? That's causing atherosclerosis? That doesn't make any sense.
I agree. It doesn't make sense. That's why nobody says that. He's confusing oscillations in a physiological parameter, which is normal, with having it sky high 24/7 for years. Our blood pressure goes up with exercise. Guess what? Exercise is still good for you. Chronic hypertension for years, not so much. LDL is the same. It oscillates with fasting, eating, circadian rhythms throughout the course of the day. That's normal. But if your LDL remains sky high chronically for years and years, that's a risk factor. Great. Now let's go into the next argument made, which is that elevated LDL is only bad in the context of a low HDL or a high glucose. In other words, it's not an independent risk factor. Let's start with the HDL hypothesis, which is that high LDL is not necessarily negative if the individual also has high HDL. He used the Framingham heart study to justify this.
This is correlation, this is epidemiology. Increasing risk of cardiovascular disease on the y-axis, LDL on the x-axis, okay? So it's things like this that make people say, oh yeah, LDL, it's probably causing atherosclerosis, which is the formation of plaque within the arterial wall. But go to the other one, Jamie, CAC, LDL, HDL. So this is the exact same data stratified by a third variable. And this is what is never considered with LDL, in my opinion. The lipid hypothesis is flawed because it's incomplete. It misses the third variable or fourth variable. In this stratification, we've looked at HDL. We've looked at the, quote, good cholesterol, which we really don't know a whole lot about, probably an immune participant. But HDL levels do correlate with metabolic health, synonymous with insulin resistance. So what can we say about these people? This is the exact same data that I've split into four lines here. Those with the lowest level of HDL are the most metabolically unhealthy. These are the most obese, the most likely to have the most likely to have diabetes, the most likely to have insulin resistance. You can see they have a pretty good risk of relative risk of cardiovascular disease as LDL increases. But look at the bottom. Look at the people who are most insulin sensitive. There's essentially no correlation, or the correlation is massively different between people with a high HDL, good metabolic health, and LDL increasing. Does that make sense?
Interesting hypothesis. Let's start with the Framingham heart study, which clearly demonstrated a biological gradient. As LDL cholesterol levels increased, so did the risk of cardiovascular disease. However, when the data was stratified by HDL levels, a similar pattern emerged, suggesting that both LDL and HDL were independent risk factors. But it's important to remember that the Framingham Heart Study was observational and correlational in nature. These types of studies are excellent for generating hypotheses, but they cannot establish causation. And guess what? Paul Saladino knows about this.
And so epidemiology can generate correlations, but we cannot draw causative inference from that data. We can have a correlation which we then test with an interventional study.
To determine whether a factor truly causes disease, we need randomized controlled trials or an interventional study. And here's where things get interesting. When put to the test, raising HDL cholesterol does not appear to reduce cardiovascular risk. Here's a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials where we have 117,411 patients in 39 trials, and it states, although observational studies, and this is probably alluding to the Framingham Heart Study, might suggest a simplistic hypothesis for HDL cholesterol, substantial use of agents that increase HDL cholesterol does not reduce coronary heart disease. What about elevated LDL cholesterol? Well, Paul Saladino thinks there isn't much evidence for this.
What's the root of this hypothesis?
It's a lot of epidemiology, Mendelian randomizations, and genome-wide association studies. Epidemiology is essentially an observational study. There's no experiment done. They're giving people surveys, and they're either following them moving forward, prospective, or they're looking back at what they've done in the past, a retrospective study.
He's very wrong here. In fact, there's plenty of randomized control trials or interventional studies which show a direct link between LDL cholesterol and heart disease.
This randomized clinical trial done in Northern Europe lowered LDL cholesterol in over 4,000 people, and cardiovascular risk dropped by 34%. This randomized clinical trial, done in the UK, lowered LDL cholesterol in 20,000 people. Coronary death fell by 18%, major coronary events by 27%. This randomized clinical trial conducted in the US lowered LDL cholesterol in over 4,000 people. Major coronary events fell by 24%, strokes by 31%. This randomized clinical trial, done in Scotland, lowered LDL cholesterol in 6,000 people. It cut cardiovascular risk by 31% and cardiovascular death by 32%. This randomized clinical trial done in Australia lowered LDL cholesterol in over 9,000 people. It cut coronary death by 24% and heart attacks by 29%. When you use a drug, it can have multiple effects. So it's good to see different drugs so you can rule out off-target effects. So in this randomized clinical trial, they used a different class of drug to lower LDL cholesterol in 27,000 people. It reduced cardiovascular risk by 15 to 20%. Here they used a third different class of drug to lower LDL cholesterol. Cardiovascular risk was reduced by 34%.
We could keep going. We've barely scraped the surface, but I'm sure you have better things to do. Again, these studies are listed in some of the top clinical journals in the world. We're talking randomized, placebo-controlled trials, thousands of subjects per study. This is the highest tier of evidence, and they started being published 30 years ago and all the way up to very recently. Rather than individually going through every single study, let's look at a consensus statement from the European Atherosclerosis Society Consensus Panel. Consistent evidence from numerous and multiple different types of clinical and genetic studies unequivocally establishes that LDL causes atherosclerotic disease. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, unequivocally means that the idea is expressed very clearly, without doubt. And I like this graph here, which shows randomized controlled trials, prospective follow-up studies, as well as Mendelian randomization studies. What do we observe? The greater the magnitude of exposure to LDL cholesterol, the higher the incidence of coronary artery disease. Now, you might also notice that the strength of the effect seems to differ across study types. It appears the lowest in randomized controlled trials, higher in prospective cohort studies, and the highest in Mendelian randomization studies. The discrepancy here largely reflects a difference in the duration of LDL exposure. RCTs had a median follow-up of around 5 years, prospective cohort studies around 12 years, and the Mendelian randomization studies reflected lifetime exposure, which was around 52 years. This pattern illustrates a biological gradient not only with the level of LDL cholesterol, but also with the duration of exposure, both of which are strongly associated with the increased risk of coronary artery disease. According to the Bradford-Hill criteria for establishing causality in epidemiology, the presence of such a biological gradient where increased exposure consistently leads to an increased risk is a key factor strongly indicating a causal relationship. So, to summarize, LDL cholesterol causes heart disease, HDL cholesterol does not prevent heart disease. So now we're on to the final straw that these carnivore grifters use to save themselves, which is that LDL cholesterol is only bad for the majority of the population because they are metabolically unhealthy and or have insulin resistance.
My cholesterol is high, I'll be honest with you. Many doctors would tell me to get on a statin, but I'm not gonna do that because I'm metabolically healthy. It's easy to test this. You can just get a fasting insulin. And we know that in humans who are metabolically healthy, levels of LDL cholesterol are horribly bad at predicting cardiovascular disease.
And when I look at the details of LDL in connection with cardiovascular disease, what I find is that there are many instances where LDL cholesterol does not associate with cardiovascular disease. Any study in which LDL cholesterol is stratified by a metric that correlates with insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance, you see totally different amounts of correlation between LDL and cardiovascular disease when people are very insulin resistant versus minimally insulin resistant.
Now, with the studies he's just mentioned on the screen, you will not see a single randomized controlled trial, and indeed he has just shown correlational data, which, as I've mentioned numerous times in this video, is used to generate hypotheses. In stark contrast, here's a meta-analysis of 14 randomized controlled trials published in The Lancet, which is a very well-respected journal. They looked at lowering LDL cholesterol in various different contexts. The result, and I quote, was that there was a significant, approximately 21% proportional reduction in major vascular events per millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol in people with diabetes, i.e. metabolically unhealthy, which was like the effect observed in those without diabetes. And again, here's another clinical trial where patients were stratified with 4 major risk factors for diabetes: metabolic syndrome, impaired fasting glucose, a BMI greater than 30, or a HbA1c greater than 6%. Irrespective of whether patients had any of these factors or not, lowering LDL cholesterol conferred a protective benefit for cardiovascular disease. By the way, if anyone from the carnivore community would like to debate me on this topic, more than happy to just message me. So now that we've established that elevated LDL cholesterol causes heart disease, irrespective of whether you have diabetes/metabolic syndrome, what can you do? Well, you have 2 options. Number 1 is the non-pharmacological approach, which mainly has to do with diet. The literature is abundantly clear regarding this. It is largely the saturated fat as opposed to dietary cholesterol, which elevates your LDL cholesterol. Now, it is true that animal foods tend to be higher in saturated fat. I'm not going to go into the debates about the ethics of veganism. That's a separate conversation. But what I do want to do is address a common misconception, which is that because animal foods contain saturated fats, they need to be avoided altogether. Personally, I like to take more of a nuanced view. From a protein quality perspective, animal foods are the most bioavailable and complete sources of protein. That's not really up for debate. Can you make a vegan diet work? Absolutely, but it requires more planning, especially around amino acid completeness and nutrient timing. What's actually important is how you consume animal products, and specifically how you manage saturated fat intake. There's plenty of ways to include high quality animal protein while keeping the saturated fat low. Some examples I regularly use is having low fat yogurt with vanilla protein powder. Here you get 50 grams of protein, 0 grams of saturated fat in one serving. You can have chicken breast instead of thigh. You'll have 50 grams of protein for 2 grams of saturated fat in 200 grams of chicken breast. And you can use lean cuts of red meat. I'm from Australia. Here we have kangaroo, which is widely available, 50 grams of protein, 4 to 5 grams of saturated fat. The benefits of these leaner, higher protein, lower fat cuts of meat is that they're generally more satiating for fewer calories as well, which is also beneficial from a weight loss point of view. It also makes it easier to be calorically restricted, which in numerous studies has also been shown to be beneficial from a longevity point of view. The American Heart Association recommends aiming for a dietary pattern that achieves less than 6% of your total calories from saturated fat. Again, if you use the examples I just mentioned, this is not difficult to do. The second approach is pharmacological, and this is where many people push back. But here's the reality. Elevated LDL cholesterol is highly modifiable, and in many cases, up to 80% of it is genetically determined. Even if your diet includes more animal products or you have a naturally high cholesterol, there's nothing wrong with using pharmacology like statins to bring yourself into a safer range and reduce your cardiovascular risk.
Maybe this diet is doing a lot of really good things for me. It's improving my insulin sensitivity. I feel better. I have fewer energy swings. But this one thing isn't so good. But here's the thing, of all the things that could go wrong, that's about the most treatable one out there. It's very easy to treat elevated ApoB. And so that's the part. I mean, and this is what we do clinically, right? This is how we treat patients, right? We have patients who only get better on very, very carbohydrate restricted diets. But then, you know, if they develop that pattern, that elevated LDL pattern, we have a choice to make, which is we abandon the diet or we treat the elevated ApoB. And that's not a failure. That's simply using modern medicine to help us achieve the best of both worlds.
Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know if there's any other topics you want me to cover. And make sure to check out this video where I teach you exactly how to get into the top 2% of cardiovascular fitness. I'll see you in the next one.